Okay, so now in this chapter, chapter 2, what we start to do here is build up public finance as an understanding of it being um, a microeconomic field of thought. So what that means is that we're generally now dealing, if you remember back to intermediate microeconomics, we're going to be dealing with indifference curves and budget constraints, and the whole issues of constrained maximization. And that's exactly what we see right here. Constrained utility maximization. When we say constrained utility maximization, we mean that there are some budgetary choices that force certain amounts of a good to be consumed, which then constrains my ability to maximize my utility. For instance, as an example of that would be like if I get food stamps, I can only use my food stamps on food. But I could actually use that money better if I was just given that. If I were just given straight money, I would use the amount I want for food, and then I would buy the other things that I need. Food stamps force me to buy a certain amount, as an example of then our constrained utility maximization. Then we put that tool to work. Now we're going to talk about the labor supply curve, and we're going to look at the TANF program, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, and we're going to look at how the receipt of money from TANF reduces the labor supply. And we're then going to explore how the social welfare, how welfare in general constrains our equilibrium choices. And then we'll just finish it off by talking a little bit more about the TANF program. Okay, so we're going to start here in chapter 2 looking at the theoretical tools. In chapter 3, we start to look at the empirical tools. Okay, so let's start this off by talking about constrained utility maximization and what it is. All this slide kind of tells us here, tries to remind us, is how we think about indifference curves and budget constraints. So let's try to graph this out here. Let me pause the video here, and then I'm going to set up the digital pen. Okay, so there are going to be like fancier slides here that have this much better drawn out, but I'm just going to draw it freehand so you can kind of see it being made here as well. So again, imagine that we have an XY space where we have the quantity of good 1 and the quantity of good 2. Now, what we would draw here are indifference curves. So how do we generate an indifference curve again? Just to remind ourselves here, we have particular bundles of goods, right? So this is a combination of goods 1 and good 2. And what we do is we connect all the bundles that generate the same amount of utility. The math isn't here to show you which ones would be which, but I'm just going to draw this one here that goes through these 3. And we're just going to call this U1. And so along this indifference curve, the utility is constant. Now, the goal of the consumer is always going to be to get the highest indifference curve. So they want to be on the indifference curve furthest from the origin. Along each of these indifference curves, the utility or the satisfaction is constant. What constrains the individual is their level of income. And so what we do is we end up finding an indifference curve that is furthest from the origin, but is still affordable. So then the goal to add to this is the highest indifference curve subject to the budget constraint. Now, why are we talking about this here? Well, the idea here is that when you get income from the government, sometimes it's not just straight income, right? It's income in kind, meaning if I get a Section 8 voucher for housing, my income goes up, but it forces me to buy, if Q1 is housing, it forces me to buy a certain amount of good. So in other words, our budget constraint, let's make it in blue here, can look weird like this, right? Which means that I can buy more housing, but at some point, right, that voucher is then used up, and then I go back to my regular indifference curve. But now with this non-linear shape of this budget constraint, you can see that I can end up at a suboptimal indifference curve. That's where we're going with our discussion here. Okay, so let's continue on. So I've already stated this. There's not much more for me to state about it. You can read this. You don't need me to read it, but I feel like I should. Let's just read a little bit here. Again, so our utility function is where we are keeping our indifference curve constant, or our utility constant, and we are trying to find the optimal choice that satisfies, doesn't exceed our available budget. And I've already stated this, but these 2 points are important. That we always want to be on the highest indifference curve. That's important. And that these are always downward sloping. Why are they downward sloping? They're downward sloping. And not only are they downward sloping, but I'm going to add here. I'm not sure why the author didn't say this. But they also get flatter and steeper. Oh, geez. Or just keep in mind here, my handwriting is dictated by this little pad I'm writing on here. But they get flatter and steeper, meaning it gets steeper and then it gets flatter. Steeper and then flatter. Steeper and then flatter. And they're parallel to each other. Why is that? That's because of the law of diminishing marginal utility. That as you get more and more of Q1, of good one, the additional satisfaction from it is getting less and less. And then if we're talking about good 2 over here, now it's the reverse, because the slope of this is the marginal utility of good 1 over the marginal utility of good 2. And it is negative. It's negative because of the law of diminishing marginal utility, that as we consume more and more of the good, we get less and less additional happiness. So our marginals, the additional, is decreasing. Okay, let's go back over here. And so you see this discussion here. Here are some nicely drawn indifference curves, where a point on a higher indifference curve is preferred to one on a lower indifference curve. Not too surprising here. And at any 2 points along the same indifference curve, the consumer would be indifferent, meaning there'd be no strong preference one way or the other, hence the name indifference curve. And that points on a higher indifference curve are preferred, strictly preferred. And that, if you remember back from your intermediate micro course, that we determine our shape of every of these indifference curves based on the utility function that underlies it. You're not going to be responsible for doing that math here. You just need to be comfortable with the concept of marginals, which we can start to see right here. That if I give you a utility function for goods, cakes, and movies, and that utility function can be described as the square root of the multiplication of the two, and we start plugging in numbers, we can get what that total utility number would be. And as we build from that, as I said, the diminishing marginal utility becomes an important point here because it does create our downward sloping indifference curve. And it does cause its shape as well, where it's steep and then gets flatter, steep and then gets flatter, steep and then gets flatter. Hence, as it says right here, the first bite of pizza is the tastiest. The 50th causes you to vomit because you've eaten so much and you can't possibly eat anymore. Right, which is true of most any goods, right? If you consume way too much, you get sick of eating the item. Eating the item causes you to feel ill or never want to eat it again. That's like me and donuts. For some reason, well, not for some reason, I know the reason. I worked at a gas station as a teenager, and the benefit I was told was that I could have as many donuts as I wanted to eat. I thought it was the most fantastic job in the world for the first week until I just kept eating so many donuts that I never want to eat donuts again. And yeah, I'll eat donuts from time to time, but most of the time, one donut's enough for me, which I know sounds odd, but if you want to stop yourself from over consuming something, just eat a lot of it, I guess, and then you'll probably stop eating it. And this just repeats what I said. It's flatter and steeper. Steeper on the left side, flatter on the right side because of this law of diminishing marginal utility. The ratio of the marginal utilities of the goods, if you remember from intermediate micro, is called the marginal rate of substitution. It would, in this case here, if this is good 1 and this is good 2, it's negative because of that law of diminishing marginal utility and that trade-off that exists. It's going to be the marginal utility of the good on the x-axis, which in this case is good 1, over the marginal utility of the good on the y-axis, which in this case is good 2. That ratio of the marginal utilities is our marginal rate of substitution. So the marginal rate of substitution, as you can see, changes along the curve. Why is it changing along the curve? Well, this slide makes it quite apparent why that's the case. Because as we're getting, in this case now, more movies, the numerator of the ratio, remember, so in this case it would be negative mu of movies over mu of cakes, that the marginal utility is declining as the quantity of movies is increasing. So that would mean that the numerator is getting smaller and that the denominator is getting larger as we go from left to right. So as we read this graph from left to right, let's say we add particular points, we can see that our quantity of cakes is falling. So quantity of cakes is falling. That would mean the marginal utility from cakes is rising because I've got less of them. and that over here, my quantity of movies is increasing. That means that my marginal utility of movies is falling. So I've got a numerator that's decreasing. I've got a denominator that's increasing. That just means that the slope is getting even smaller and smaller. Okay. Now, again, our constraint here is our budget constraint. This is our limit for our pursuit of goods, right? If we didn't have this kind of limit, we would just consume unlimited amounts. So something's got to stop what we're doing here. And that comes down to our available income and the prices of the goods. So if we don't save any money, which I know is a little bit of an extreme assumption here, but if we don't save any income, then our total income would be equal to the amount that we spend on cakes, which is the price of cakes times the quantity of cakes, plus our total budget that's allocated to movies, which is the price of movies times the number of movies that we buy. There is obviously an opportunity cost present, and what that opportunity per cost tells us is what we could have done with that money instead. So, budget constraint is a straight line. And why is it a straight line? Because in this case here, the slope is equal to the price ratio, which in general terms is the price of the good on the x-axis over the price of the good on the y-axis, which in this case is P of M over P of C. Now, this stays constant. The price isn't changing at all. So a movie always costs $8, and a cake always costs 16. Which just keeps us at -1/2, and that stays the same throughout. Okay. And I know I'm kind of going over this a little bit quickly, but again, the general presumption here is you've taken intermediate micro, and I'm just kind of reminding you of what you once knew, what you had once remembered. If we're putting it all together and trying to understand our optimized point, then what we're doing here is again trying to find something where our indifference curve, we're pursuing the highest indifference curve subject to the budget constraint. Or in other words, at this point, the two slopes are equal, meaning that negative P of the good on the x-axis over the price of the good on the y-axis is equal to the negative ratio of the marginal utility of the good on the x-axis over the marginal utility of the good on the y-axis. At these points, we can say, for instance, why wouldn't it be A? And why wouldn't it be B? Well, the first thing we could say is that we're not on the highest indifference curve. That would be obvious, right? Because we could draw another parallel indifference curve that's further from the origin. But there's another thing that we can say that's going on. Over here at point A, if we're to kind of eyeball the slopes here, this would reveal that the marginal rate of substitution at point A, that the marginal rate of substitution is greater than the price ratio because it's steeper, right? If I were to draw a line of tangency, it's steeper than the price ratio. Or if we start rearranging the terms here, let's do this a different way. Let's go back over to here. If I cross multiply and rearrange these terms, I'll end up with MUX over PX equals MUY over PY. That the marginal utility per dollar spent is equal. When it's not, such as right here, then at this point at A, what we would say is that MUX over PX is greater than MUY. Sorry, I'm not greater than, sorry. That MUX over PX is greater than MUY over PY. Now, how did I know that? Well, in this case here, this MRS is again MUX over MUY. If I start cross multiplying and rearranging the terms, what I find is that the marginal utility per dollar spent on good X is less than it is for the good on the y-axis. So what would a person do in that case? They would buy the good where they get more utility per dollar spent, which in this case would be the good on the y-axis, which in this case is cakes. As they spend more on y, they end up spending less on x. And the opposite is true right here. This would be where we are at point B. Okay. I already said this, but it's good to have it on a slide, I suppose. That the point of maximizing utility is where the slope of the budget constraint is equal to the slope of the indifference curve. In other words, a picture like that. The two slopes are equal to each other, with the budget constraint presumably acting as a line of tangency on the indifference curve, which we see right here. At B, why do we know A is optimal, I guess, compared to B and C? To review our argument from the past two slides. First, we know that A is optimal because it's on a higher indifference curve. But we also know that A is optimal because at A, the slope of the indifference curve is equal to the slope of the budget constraint. And at that same budgetary level, we could say at this point here, at point B, the person is consuming, in this case here, that the slope of the marginal rate of substitution, the slope of the indifference curve is steeper than the budget constraint. And that over here, the slope of the budget constraint, the price ratio, is steeper than the slope of the indifference curve. This person here has clearly too many movies. This person here has clearly too many cakes. And they need to reallocate their budget. How do they know at B and C that they're at the wrong points? Because they're not equaling the marginal utility per dollar spent. And so when we look at this, why do we draw in difference curves and budget constraints? If you remember, again, back from intermediate microeconomics, right? Or even just going all the way back to principles, right? One of the very first things you learned in principles was that the demand curve is downward sloping. And we just remembered, you were told to remember this law of demand, where the price goes down and the quantity goes up. And so you just, in principles, just remembered that. It's doubtful you would have gone any further, further than that. Because it was then in intermediate microeconomics where you started to ask yourself, why is that the case? Beyond just saying that people buy more of a thing that is cheaper. And that was when we take into account the substitution effect and the income effect. In the substitution effect, we are holding the utility level constant, and in the income effect, we're holding the price of the goods constant. In the substitution effect, what we're saying is that what happens to the individual as a good becomes cheaper, relatively speaking. And with the income effect, we're saying, what do we do when we feel richer? Now, I've got other videos. If you want my videos from when I teach intermediate micro and you want this particular video, let me know. And, the book also does go into some detail, but if you want to see someone doing it, obviously you can also just YouTube it, I suppose. But if you want to hear me describing it for you and graphing it out in more specifics, I can do that as well. But I just don't want this lecture to become super, super long. Because on the next slide, we can kind of see this here. And so let me try to zoom out on this and then talk about it a little bit more. Let's just go, is that too big? There we go. So what's going on here? We've got our original budget constraint here, which is BC1, and our original indifference curve, which is IC1. Two things are going to happen here. Okay, when the price, in this case, when the price goes down, in this case here, we're looking at the price of cakes going down in price. Then what happens is that we have to start out by describing the substitution effect. What we need to do is we need to draw a new indifference curve that's just parallel to the original indifference curve and is reflecting the new budget constraint. Keeping us, now we have to stay, at least initially here for the substitution effect, staying on the original indifference curve. So our substitution effect just measures the fact that given the changed price of the good, that I'll buy more cakes as they become cheaper in price. And so we see this person reallocating or substituting cakes for movies as cakes become cheaper relative to movies. So that's our movement from A to B. Now, substitution effect always, always, always works in that direction. That the good that is becoming cheaper, the substitution effect causes a person to buy more of that good. The income effect for a normal good reinforces the substitution effect. But what we know is that for an inferior good, the income effect works in the opposite direction. So it'll slightly counteract the substitution effect, but not overwhelm it. That's why, even for an inferior good, the demand curve is still downward sloping. Now, what we do then to capture the income effect is we use that budget constraint line drawn exactly parallel, and we bring it down to reflect, to get to the point where it's just tangent to our newly drawn indifference curve. And that's our shift, or our movement from B to C. And that's our income effect right here. Such that on the demand curve, we see A to C as the total movement, but we can break it down again into substitution effect and income effect. And so that's what we see right here. Now, instead of changing the price, if we change the income level, then we know that the shift of the curve, right? Oh, sorry. No, it's actually just actually re-explaining what I just said here. Sorry about that. Just saying that for both of these kinds of goods, normal goods and inferior goods, the demand curve for both of those goods is downward sloping. It's just that for the normal good, the income effect reinforces the substitution effect. And that for the inferior good, it slightly counteracts the substitution effect, but doesn't overwhelm it. Okay, I'm going to skip learning by doing here. Just out of time. But let's start to talk about the temporary assistance for needy family program as we start to then put this to work here. So this was created in 1996. It was created in part from the fact that the Republicans in the Congress under Newt Gingrich were starting to, had really wanted to reform the social support network that really hadn't been revised since it was first created in the 1960s. And what the temporary assistance for needy family program did is it provides a monthly support check. As you can see here, it provides basically money to families that have a certain income level. And so Joelle, single mother, spends all of her money and her TANF benefits on food for her and her children. Now, here's the problem, right? Is that if she works more, then she'll earn more money. But if she works more, right, it's going to do two things. It's going to mean that she has less time at home, obviously, but it could also affect at the limit level for TANF. It could limit how much she's willing to work because she doesn't want to lose her TANF benefits. So it raises this question here, whether she's earning these TANF benefits or not, of how much labor is she going to be willing to supply. And I don't know even why they say single mothers. It really could be single fathers as well, or just any single parent. Okay, so the TANF budget. Again, remember the TANF money in this case, unlike food stamps, it's not constrained to the consumption of a certain good. It can be used on anything. Then in this case here, if she takes no leisure, right? If she reduces her leisure all the way down to 0, then she gets her maximum amount of food that she can consume. If she takes as much leisure as she possibly can, then she can't eat anything. Okay, so there's our trade-off. Now, again, once we get this TANF guarantee, do you see what happens here to the budget constraint? it now has a pivot in it. Because now what's happening is that once she starts to work a certain amount, right, then what happens is that once she earns a certain amount of food money, then the TANF benefit would go away. So in this case, it starts to constrain her truly to having 2,000. She would be able to consume a certain amount of leisure, but still have some income because of this TANF benefit. But again, if she gets to a point where she exceeds the income bracket for receiving these benefits, the TANF benefit goes away. So we can see here that what's all changing here is that what's changing is the slope. If we reduce the benefit, the TANF benefit, then the budget constraint shape changes again, and then changes the amount of leisure that she decides to consume. Why is this happening here, or what's the purpose of this discussion? Um, there's a lot of different ways to see this here, but I'm going to be rather blunt with the way that I see it as I'm not using TANF benefits, and I generally am of the philosophy that people that need this kind of help generally need this kind of help. That I don't think, in general, people are trying to get rich just by collecting TANF benefits. But the notion was that people that collect benefits are lazy and that they don't work enough, and that we need to encourage these individuals to work more. The idea that poverty is caused by laziness rather than something else. So that's what this program was designed to do. It was designed to have a non-zero amount of labor, meaning you would face an incentive to work, and the TANF benefit would just allow you to work at a low-wage job. So, right, what we can see here that's changing is the slope as we change the level of the benefit, depending on which one we're talking about here, which TANF level we're talking about, 5,000 or 3,000. But what we can see is that as we change the as we change the budget constraint, we're obviously on different indifference curves, and then we're at different optimal points. Now, again, this is deciding for us how much labor we're going to supply, right? Because that's the counter to the leisure. And so what we do is we have to then, as we think about this here, we have to think about that if the TANF benefit in this case goes down from $5,000 to $3,000, how much more labor will people decide to provide? Okay, so let's look at that here. So when the TANF guarantee is $5,000, then we're operating on the blue line, right? Because that was our first kind of point here. So our blue line here, our optimal point here is one where we have 1,910 hours of leisure, and we have a total income of $5,450. So the $450 is coming from labor, and the $5,000 is coming from the government. Okay, people then, right, here's the scenario. People complain. They say that poor people are lazy, they're not working enough, and we're going to reduce the level of the benefit. Well, we can already know that if you've got to survive, then you're going to work more. And that's what we see on the red lines here. So the red line, we've got now a new budget constraint, a new indifference curve that it's just tangent to, and now the person has less leisure, falling from 1910 to 1655. But because the TANF benefit is now lower, my total income is now lower, $47.25. So people are now at point B are working more and getting less than they were at point A. What we have to kind of be careful about here is what happens? What happens if the benefit is enough to allow the individual to not have to work at all in either situation? What if the TANF benefit was large enough that the person didn't have to work? Then we see that right here, right? Is that in this case, lowering the TANF benefit from 5,000 to 3,000 causes no change in the number of leisure hours because at both points the person is able to live on what is provided because they value that leisure quite highly. And this is then what comes down to what welfare economics is. So the welfare economics isn't referring to like welfare as like a program. What it's referring to is the well-being of every individual, what their utility levels are from the things that they're doing. And so what we look at here, and this would be something that's used a great deal in public finance, is that we look at how changing certain benefit levels causes changes in the level of utility for certain individuals. And so what that requires us to do is it requires us to look at the demand for those certain things that families buy and calculate then the utility that comes from buying those goods. Which brings us right here, right? So then the question would be things like, why do we have, you know, why do we, as a society, provide certain benefits for certain things like food, and why don't we have one, for instance, for movies? Why do we provide that benefit, a benefit for poor families for internet access, but we don't provide one for cable TV? All these comes down to notions of necessity and the utility that comes from it. And what we can see here is that as I start to, in this case, provide a benefit that provides, as I start to derive the demand curve for movies, which means that I lower the price, I keep lowering the price of the good on the x-axis, then my optimal point keeps moving to the right. In this drop-down graph, which you probably remember from intermediate micro, was how we derived our demand curve, why the demand curve is downward sloping as the price of movies goes down. And we then take with that the idea that the elasticity is not going to be constant as well along the demand curve, that the elasticity elasticity of demand, which is always negative, what it tends to do is it tends to become more and more elastic along the curve. And that we do have some goods where there's perfect elasticity and inelasticity. The perfect inelasticity would be for an essential good, let's say a prescription drug. Perfectly elastic would be like buying, well, it's not exactly perfectly elastic, but I don't know, premium, I don't know, NFL Sunday football ticket, right? Where you can watch all the NFL games regardless of where you live. It wouldn't be infinitely elastic, but I would hope that if you're facing budgetary problems, that might be one of the first things you cut. So let's just at least agree that the elasticity is pretty high for that good. Okay, so those are the extremes, at least, of the elasticities. Now, as we put that together, right, in terms of the elasticity of demand, what's countering that is the supply, right? And we know supply back all the way back from principles of econ, where we're just looking at firms that are trying to maximize their profit, right? And they're trying to minimize their costs of production, where their costs of production are for labor, for the raw materials, and for capital goods to make those products. Hence the capital here, the labor here, and then we could add into that the cost of the resources themselves. These firms are countering with that, right? That they're trying to maximize their, they're looking at the productivity of each input. So just as we did for consumers, that the marginal utility of labor over the price of labor, which is the wage rate, is equal to, sorry, not you, the marginal productivity of labor is equal to the marginal productivity of capital over the price of capital, which in this case is the rental rate. Even if you own it, you're considered to be renting it out to yourself. The same math is involved, though, just as it was for the consumer, right? This is the end result. Before we got to that point, we were talking about the slope of the isoquant being equal to the slope of our isocost line. Where isocost lines are shaped like budget constraints and isoquants are shaped like indifference curves. Except instead of utility, we're referring to number of products sold. And for the budget constraint, well, in the isocost, we're both concerned with money, amount spent. And we just find equilibrium, which we see right here. Now, the only difference that then starts to emerge here that we need to do when we're looking at public finance, which would mean we're looking at everyone, not just each individual on their own, that would mean that we need to then start to look at consumer surplus and producer surplus and the way in which sometimes individual consumers doing what's best for themselves doesn't maximize the surplus for the entire society, hence the term social efficiency. To remind ourselves, the consumer surplus is the best way to put it here informally here would be like feeling like you got a good deal. That means that you would have been willing to pay more than you actually paid. And the producer has the same surplus, that producer surplus, which is not the same thing as profit, but the producer surplus would have been willing to accept less money, but instead they were able to get more. And so what that means for us here is that the consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve to the price. And these are just three different demand curves. It's always the same. Area below the demand curve to the price. And that for the producer surplus, it's the area above the supply curve to the price. Again, just having three different supply curves. Again, not the same thing as profit. And you may remember this from either principles or intermediate micro. But what we then do is that we say when we're at the equilibrium, P subscript E, Q subscript D, with at equilibrium point Z, then this entire triangle can be split up into the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. If we start regulating the price or regulating the quantity, it then changes the surplus. It leads us to this first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, which from the term alone should make you think that the term is important or the definition is important. What the first fundamental theorem states is that when we're at equilibrium, we are at maximized total surplus, total social efficiency. But that what happens is that as we start to restrict the market, by either restricting the price or restricting the quantity, what we create is a deadweight loss, which reduces the total surplus or the social efficiency. So the whole point here then, in terms of what we even try to do here in public finance, is we try to reduce the size of that deadweight loss, a transfer of surplus that doesn't go to anyone else. And it leads us here to our second fundamental theorem. So our first fundamental theorem was that social efficiency is maximized when we're at the competitive equilibrium price and quantity. And our second fundamental theorem states that we can redistribute the resources among the individuals, but if we allow people to still freely trade, then we can still get an efficient outcome. It's pretty tough to do this, to fulfill the second fundamental theorem. And that's because it's difficult to create a situation where individuals are allowed to freely trade. What does that mean? Like, what would be a way that we could state that? Just to go back to my earliest example here, where I was talking about food stamps, and let's say a family is given too much in food stamps but doesn't have enough income. I could sell my extra food, but the idea is that I wouldn't get the same price as the store got for the food. So there'd be some loss there. And that in any case, that what we're always trying to do here is we're trying to balance our loss in efficiency with having more equity. And it's a difficult and controversial trade-off at best in terms of trying to balance these two things. Okay, so all that really means for us here is that if we look at the social welfare function, what we're doing is adding up all the individuals. The only alternative to this kind of utilitarian social welfare function, would be if we looked at this from a Rawlsian perspective. And in the Rawlsian perspective, what we're trying to do is maximize the utility, not of the total sum, but rather maximize the utility of the worst off person. So we're trying to maximize the minimum of that set, which in this case, if U1 is the poorest person, then we'd be trying to maximize that lowest utility number from a Rawlsian perspective. What other ways could we think about how to try to make everyone, how to get better equity rather than efficiency? Well, we could look at some other different criteria. The one being the commodity egalitarianism, the other being equality of opportunity, which political parties, if we looked at this from a political party perspective, we tend to see Republicans at least state that they're for the equality of opportunity, and that we tend to see that Democrats in general are more for commodity egalitarianism. They don't overlap. That's why the two parties seem to fight with each other about things. Right? So commodity egalitarianism would say that everyone has a right to health care, or everyone has a right to housing, or a college education. Those are not things you would hear from a Democrat. They tend to be the things you hear from those are the things you tend to hear from a Democrat, who are then basically talking about commodity egalitarianism. We're talking about the Republicans. So it's, and this is important to recognize. It's not that Democrats just give, and they're the most generous people, and that Republicans don't give. It's just that their notion of equity is different. And so the equality of opportunity is kind of raise yourself up in the bootstraps, provide opportunities for individuals to succeed, and rewards when they do succeed. And so if we go back to, as we kind of wrap up this lecture here, if we go back to what effect does TANF have, is that if we didn't have TANF, then just the labor market is in competitive equilibrium, which we know from the first fundamental welfare theorem means that we're at maximized total surplus. When we do have TANF, what we know is that the labor supply falls because now people are able to consume more leisure. As a result, it does create deadweight loss. If we reduce the TANF benefits, then people end up working more, so the supply is increasing, and the social efficiency rises. But we've got less leisure, which probably doesn't make the headlines as much. And so that's what we can see here, right? Is that the deadweight loss becomes smaller as the TANF benefits are reduced. And we basically, that becomes, as kind of our last slide here, that basically then becomes part of our debate, right? Is that from an from an efficiency perspective, providing TANF benefits is a bad thing. It creates a deadweight loss. We now have to justify it. Is it good that some individuals are able to consume some leisure? Again, all depends on our social welfare function. Do we do it from a Rawlsian perspective, that everyone should enjoy a certain amount of leisure? Or do we do it even again from a commodity egalitarianism perspective, where individuals should all have a certain amount of food and all a certain amount of minimum income? Okay, I'm going to skip these. And that's our conclusions. Okay.